recording this. And hello, I'm Teri Cohan Link, principal of LINKCO. Greetings, good morning, good afternoon, good evening for those of you joining us from other sections of North America and around the globe. I'm excited to welcome you and thank you for attending the webinar, pardon me, Messy Disruption Part 2 with George Sullivan, founder of Net Zero Analysis and Design Corp, whom I will introduce in a few moments. The Resilient Realism webinar series developed out of insights shared by business leaders about the current and dynamically shifting business climate during recovery from COVID-19. The conversations resulted in a white paper entitled Resilient Realism. This is LINKCO's way of giving back and sharing relevant information we learned speaking with business leaders on a day-to-day basis as part of our ongoing executive search practice. The summary of the white paper is on the LINKCO website. In wake of COVID-19, many of the respondents have been grappling with changing business realities, economics related to their assets, products and services, remote hybrid workforces, and changing workspace demands and expectations, challenges of workflow and timetables, particularly now during the recovery phase of COVID-19, how to evaluate risk, work product best remote practices to safely protect assets, clients, evolving cyber security and privacy from offsite locations, the juggle of how to lead remotely with loved ones sharing workspace and unanticipated demands on normal work time, environmental impacts of the pandemic, to note but a few of the insights, disruptors, and challenges discussed in the white paper and in the webinars to date. Today's Part 2 webinar focuses on the changing ESG, environmental, social, and governance reporting requirements recently announced by the Security and Exchange Commission and the U.S. Department of Treasury. They are confusing, and our speaker is highly qualified to unpack them for us. We will continue unpacking the confusion about terms, the dynamically shifting reporting requirements, and address your questions and take a deeper dive into ISO, carbon offsetting and carbon offset markets, and we will use the lens of the real estate industry for examples. Stay tuned for additional webinars on this topic, as this is a rapidly changing environment and we anticipate significant federal announcements after September 17th, which will be highly relevant to our conversation. You will be able to find links for all future webinars, this topic and others, on the LINKCO website. A little housekeeping. Some of you have kindly shared your questions beforehand, and those have already been integrated into the webinar's Q&A format. You may also send questions and comments in the Q&A box, and if not covered already, George will try to address them during the webinar. Now
I don't know what you mean by, we shared your questions beforehand, and those have already been integrated into the webinar's Q&A format. You may also send questions and comments in the Q&A box, and if not covered already, George will try to address them during the webinar.
Sorry about that. That's really quite something. Siri is quite responsive right now. I'm about to move my my phone into a different room. Sorry. George Sullivan is passionate about helping companies grow and prosper while mitigating their carbon footprints and meeting ESG goals by creating data-driven, scientifically valid climate action plans. He has been asked to consult with companies, organizations, learning institutions, and governments all over the world on matters of building science, renewable energy, carbon offsetting, and carbon offset generation, carbon neutrality, and net zero emissions. George founded Net Zero Analysis and Design Corp, integrating 30 years of experience in engineering, industry, commodities trading, and building science to address a large market opportunity gap created by the challenges in existing sustainability certification systems and carbon offset markets. And congratulations, George, on the Entrex announcement yesterday regarding their end-of-life capping offset solutions for oil and gas wells. I know your company, Net Zero Analysis, is the originator for Entrex's offset and offset review platform. Finally, a note about George's non-work passions. He's an avid bird watcher and he bleeds blue, for those of you that are Cubs fans. So now, without further ado, I am going to turn this over to George. Let me share the PowerPoint. 1 second. And I am going to now ask George to start sharing with us. There we go.
Teri, thanks for the great introduction. And I am looking forward to the discussion. So please feel free to drop questions in the chat as Teri put it, and she's going to be stopping me intermittently as we go through this so that we don't have to back up and re-review slides. So I would like to make it time efficient for everyone. Thanks for coming today. And so Net Zero Analysis and Design Corp does carbon project offset development, and we do it in corporate settings. We also do it in an oil patch. We just realized that there was a large opportunity there, somewhere around $500 billion. So we got together with Entrex and rolled out financing for that, and it looks like we have our first round of 7,000 wells coming online that we will be plugging and remediating. So looking forward to generating those projects. So let's get started today.
Sure, George. From the 10,000-foot level, what's the status of ESG reporting in the US, and how has that changed in 2021?
It's changed immensely. So let's take a look and do a quick background review just on the confusion of ESG here in the United States. Currently, there's no universal baseline. So we don't have a US standard for ESG reporting, and we weren't using any of the international standards for ESG reporting for anything that we were doing. And we're going to review all of those. There was no current central public reporting body that everybody agreed on and everybody was using that was transparent. It was just quite the mess here. Companies were making claims of carbon neutral energy and carbon neutrality and net zero emissions, and it was quite the mess if you were the public and or the investors, right? So couldn't compare anybody, couldn't see what they were doing. So just overall market confusion. So what changed in 2021? Well, April 9th was an SEC risk alert, and they're still updating guidelines as of earlier this week on Monday. They put out additional teeth on the guidelines. And so on the April 9th, they had everybody reporting to the UN Principles for Responsible Investing. And we're going to talk about that briefly. So when you look at it, that's the tie together. And that applies to all companies that are including any ESG disclosures. So if you're claiming green building, the SEC or the public can say, where are you reporting to on the UN? That's what that means. And that's for investors and the general public. So we're seeing a major movement in real estate just on that alone. So key takeaways from the risk alert that we denoted, and these are actually getting much denser from the announcements Monday. So is that the investors have to be using a straightforward framework for incorporating all their environmental, social, and governances. So SDGs, right, Sustainable Development Goals come into play key on this. So when you go to report, there's steps in that reporting structure where you have to measure and report your carbon footprint both on your website and to the UN publicly. So it makes it rather intriguing before you can even step into the SDGs. And the guidance is actually changing even much more intensely on a global framework. And we'll talk about that in a second. The continued takeaways that are happening is that if you're a company doing business here in the US, Canada, and Asia Pacific and Europe, it's going to get very intense for you not to be reporting even for those SDGs that you feel you fit into, right? So, and this is really going to get to the crux of the matter on disclosures. So what that means is that I can compare Apple against a construction company and see what their carbon footprints look like, how come, when, where, and why. So that will give us a solid framework, and we're going to talk more about baseline setting in a little bit. So ISO is the base standard for PAS 20 and a number of other, the corporate GHG and emissions guide is also ISO based. So if you're in real estate and you've looked at PAS 2060, that's it. The British Standards Institute generated it. It was actually a really nice standard. And now, instead of reporting to PAS, you now report to the UN. So, and the G7 accepted this, and they're now looking at implementation across all of the G7 countries, and it's supposed to go to the G25. So we'll see how that works. The Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, which is a UN group, published this in their 2021 report.
George, may I interject? Thank you. So from the 100-story level of a non-glass enveloped building, and you can comment on that if you like, would you please give us some examples from the real estate industry to make this real and help us understand the urgency and the opportunity, potential advantages for those companies who work through their asset level reporting, verification, and auditing?
Sure. So let's just take a look at what we're talking about. So this is the breakdown for energy use by sector, right? And as you can see, it breaks it down into the non-residential buildings, residential buildings, and then building construction industry is 5%. So that's overall gross energy use globally. Then you can then they turned around and did a great job of breaking it out into the various subsections of those major headings. And you can see totally that 41% of the carbon footprint of buildings, our built environment, is just strictly the buildings in the building sector. Just think about how many we remodel and things of that nature. So we're going to look at this in finer detail on a new construction building, both for carbon neutrality and net zero emissions. But I would like to summarize this report. And the requirements are very specific and very straightforward with ISO. So ISO 14000 is the definitions for carbon neutrality and net zero emissions. So they also define renewable natural gas, renewable energy. There's a whole bunch of interesting decisions in there. And you can actually look those up and go through all of those definitions. So, and they also, we're going to take a look at modeling requirements for ISO. How come, when, where, and why. And these are actually updated to each one of the COPs. So COP 26 is coming up. We expect some major modeling revisions on that. And we keep all of our models up to date. So, and then carbon offsets and carbon offsetting requirements. We're going to look at that, take a brief overview, and look at a couple of things that we have generated as carbon offset projects within our corporate audit structures.
Let me ask another question now. As Americans, we tend to ignore a global perspective. Why is that to our national peril regarding climate change? And how is this connected to the ISO 1400 series asset level verification? Why is it relevant?
Well, we're going to look at that in detail. So there is no getting away from the UN compliance. If you have a product, you manufacture it in the United States and you ship it to Europe, you have to have what's called an environmental product declaration on that product, which is its carbon footprint. And if you don't, they put a big tariff on you. So you can ignore it here in the US all you want, run around, but you're going to pay the price. And that's been going on for the last 5.5 years. The UN now mandated January 1st that if the tariffs are in effect. So there's a lot going on wrapped around that. A lot of companies are getting caught because they figured we were out of Paris. We never were. It's hard to, let's put it this way, executive order can only keep us from reporting. It cannot take us out of a treaty that's been ratified by Congress. So that's where we're standing. So let's talk about ISO, right? ISO is extremely flexible on how you can analyze a project, and set boundaries, and you've got to be transparent about how you set boundaries. So it makes great sense. And why ISO? The United Nations actually selected ISO as the international standard. If you look up ISO 14000, you'll find that the first approved versions were in late 2014, early 2015, just before the signing of Paris. And they reaffirmed it at COP25 because there was a lot of, we'll call it make-believe standards coming out primarily here in the US. And other people were claiming word terms that the UN had already defined and misapplying those word terms. So carbon neutrality for one, net zero emissions for the other. And so ISO gives you this flexibility, and it's actually a great way to compare one company to another company across the planet, one country to another country across the planet. So that's what's the nice part about ISO. There's not much else that you can really take a look at and get that type of comparison on when you sit down and do an ISO audit.
Let me ask another question. What is the International EPD, Environmental Product Declaration, and how does this relate to the EC3 Embodied Carbon in Construction Calculator tool used to determine greenhouse gas emissions for all materials used in construction and maintenance of a real estate asset? And also, how does that product produce a total embodied carbon footprint?
So let's get into that. We're going to break that down a little bit. So make it a little more edible for everybody.
Thank you.
So ISO 14, 24, and 25 are the metrics for measuring a product's GHG emissions throughout its entire life cycle, from sourcing raw materials through. So the EPD, there's the international EPD system, which is where you register your EPDs internationally to be looked up, right? And we use those all the time. And then here in the United States or North America, because it's both US and Canadian companies that founded it, the Carbon Leadership Forum is a great group. We're part of that. And they did the Embodied Carbon Calculator, EC3, and it allows you to actually look up every product. So I'm in Chicago right now. There are 3 major concrete suppliers, and I can actually look up concrete produced by all 3 of those and get EPDs. And there's quite a wide variance across the 3 suppliers on the carbon footprint per yard of concrete. So that tells you a lot about it, and they're updated annually. So many construction suppliers, many product suppliers are participating in this right out the drywall, doors, hardware, you name it. So, and you can find them all through Cliff. The EC3 model is a great way to look at a project and do your takeoffs and get an estimate on what the embodied carbon of that product or products are, or project are. So the embodied carbon is everything that goes into the building to build it, right? And you actually then can get a carbon footprint for just the materials alone. And we're going to talk a little more about carbon neutrality and carbon neutrality claims, and then net zero emissions claims using EPDs. The biggest.
Sorry, please. I have another question.
Sure.
Explain why and how ISO 14024 and 14025 are the metrics used for measuring product greenhouse gases through a life cycle analysis, please.
So it goes all the way from cradle to grave. That's the requirements of the oversight. You're tracking that entire product from material sourcing all the way through disposal. Right? It's manufacturing, it's shipping, it's install, right? And then final disposal. And most of the time, it's being disposed. It's not being recycled. It's being disposed in a landfill. Very few cities mandate concrete recycling. A lot of it goes into the trash. So, and along with that, all of the rebar and other things that come out of that. So, just looking back at our concrete example, that's where this comes into play. So it's cradle to grave, and it actually gives you a very solid set of numbers that you can then use to determine that footprint. So LCAs are used for determining your EPDs, and ISO only allows LCAs for products, and in this case, building products, right? Your phone has an EPD, your coffee cup has an EPD, the glass I was drinking water out of earlier has an EPD. So that gives you that whole system. What has happened is that the green building rating systems misapplied LCAs and applied them to buildings. Last time I asked any of my architectural friends, all of them are unique. You're constantly putting energy into that building. You're constantly changing that building footprint. You cannot model it as a static LCA, right? And they've misapplied it, and this is a gross misrepresentation of the actual carbon footprint itself of the building, right? From construction, through operations, through maintenance, and then demolition, right? So, or deconstruction, depending on how you want to look at that. But I can't tell you how an apartment is going to be used when I model an apartment building, right? How those folks are going to leave lights on, turn lights off, all sorts of other things. So saying that you can get an estimate on that, there's not any really good models that I've seen that actually come up with those. So that's why when you do a carbon footprint, you're not doing an LCA, you're actually doing a carbon footprint annually on the operation of the building. And the same would go for construction. So
let me ask another question now. Would you break down the greenhouse gas accounting and auditing and the ISO standards 14,064 and 14,065, and how do they provide guidance to the auditor to set boundaries?
Sure. Well, let's explore boundaries on this presentation. So measurement and mitigation, right? Key pieces. ISO 1464 and 65 address all the GHG accounting and verification requirements. So, and we won't dive into data. That's a whole 2-hour discussion on how data has to be collected and held. But the process is open and transparent. And scope 1 and 2 emissions, which is carbon neutrality, is everything you control or purchase. So think about it that way, right? So I purchase electricity, I purchase natural gas, I purchase gasoline. You're responsible for those emissions also in scope 1 and 2. They're not scope 3. And we've seen that sort of shift around a little bit, and we'll talk about that in a minute, that shift between scope 2 and scope 3. So this is what you're going to basically set up to measure, right? So it meets all the definitions for carbon neutrality, is offsetting the emissions scope 1 and scope 2. And you define that boundary as everything you own, control, and purchase, right? For your business, building, or other, right? So you're going to measure and offset scopes 1, 2, and 3 to meet net zero emissions. Scope 3 is your supply chain, which is huge, right? So let's just take a look at the way those scopes lay out. The Scope 1 and Scope 2 are pretty tight concentric circles. Scope 3 is, and I'll just give you an example for energy here in the United States. Your site energy, right, 1 kilowatt hour, has a Scope 3 emissions of your site energy times 2.8 plus your site energy. So that's how you figure out your Scope 3 emissions. And that's due to the grid that we exist in and the inefficiencies. It's actually come down from 3.1. So the DOE has been working on it. And once again, we're going to review Scope 1 and Scope 2, right? Sources you own and or control by the entity or the project. Scope 3 emissions occur from sources in your supply chain. So if you want to be net zero emissions, that means all of your contractors on a job site would have to be carbon neutral for all of their operations. So that gives you the view of the value chain and how much work you would have to get that done. So let's continue.
Here's another question.
Sure.
With regard to actually data mapping, what is it? If you could define it for us, please, and maybe speak a little bit more about a company's supply chain. You've already addressed that, but the indirect and direct emissions.
So we're on my laptop right now, and I'll just address the supply chain issue. So my laptop is a Dell, and I bought a carbon neutral laptop, by the way. They do sell them. Right, so it's got an EPD associated with it. So my Scope 1 emissions is all of the data that I'm using right now on this webinar, plus all the electricity and everything else my laptop uses normally, plus all the Wi-Fi data that I'm swapping out. That'd be Scope 1, Scope 2, right? Because I'm buying some of that data, in data storage, right? And so my laptop has already been certified carbon neutral with an EPD. I got all the documentation for it from Dell. But to claim net zero emissions, Dell itself would have to be carbon neutral. So I can claim carbon neutrality on my Scope 1 and 2, and on my partial Scope 3 for the electricity and data and things of that nature that I am using that are being supplied by others, because I can actually measure that. But to say I'm net zero emissions, very difficult to get Dell to go carbon neutral. They're working on it, but nobody's gotten there yet. So when you start thinking about carbon neutrality, that's just giving you that view. Now let's talk about what a data map is. Data mapping, right, is very straightforward. It's all of the data collected for your Scope 1 and Scope 2 audits. And this is refrigerants, water use, gasoline use, diesel use, electrical use. All of that comes into there, including your trash, right? What you generate coming out of the office. And all of that goes into your data map. And these are just some additional examples. All of the energy, fuel, water, refrigerants, except that the company controls. You rent in a building and you get maintenance takes care of the refrigerants for you in the building management does. But if you're the sole tenant in that, you're probably triple bottom line lease. You have to get the mechanical contractor out. He's tracking refrigerants. You need to track that refrigerant. So just as a heads up on what that looks like, right? And refrigerants can have up to a 2,100 times CO2e equivalent. So once again, that refers to your Scope 1 and 2 emissions, which are referred to as direct in this whole audit process. And the company supply chain is your indirect emissions, as I cited with Dell. So I would be able to say that when I report to the UN Climate Neutral Now program, I actually reported the company's by office, North America by office footprint data map that was run through our calculator to measure and quantify all of our emissions. So, and it's an interesting view on how that works. So, and I gave you a link to what a data map looks like. It's a giant spreadsheet. We put it together and put it out on the web for people to sort of socialize. So
let me just interject here. That this PowerPoint will be available through my website sometime later this afternoon, along with a link to the to the actual presentation for your further edification and information.
So let's talk about how this works, right? So this basically is a pictograph, as opposed to trying to explain it, on how you would set up an ISO audit process that you would do annually within a company. And this would also be an ISO audit process that you would set up with a construction site, right? With a major remodeling. There's a whole bunch of ways this is applicable. That's why I said ISO is that flexible. And it really does work nicely. So, and you run through it very quick. We download the GHG protocol. It's the Reader's Digest version of the ISO standards. It's all based on ISO. The UN does accept the GHG protocol as in scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and all the data collected there within. They also require that you have third-party validation, which we do too, and then you can go ahead and watch as they then review everything that you submit. So it's interesting. They also allow you to self-report, but we'll look at that, what that does to your score later.
Okay. So what are these audit boundaries that we've been, why are they so important? And can you provide a few examples from new construction? You've already touched on that a little bit.
Sure. We're going to start talking about the advantages of ISO, and that leads directly into the audit boundaries. So it allows for flexible boundary setting on a project. You have to tell us what's included and what you've excluded, right? That's the big deal. So if I'm not including all the environmental implications of building a building, right? Or I haven't considered the land change from greenfield site or brownfield site into redevelopment, or I'm tearing down a building and putting up a new building. There's a whole bunch of interesting audit boundaries that we've seen people dismiss. And your audit activity is directly comparable from one job site to another or one building to another on what was included and how come, when, where, and why. And when the SEC is looking at it, they're going to be looking at commonalities across all of these if you're an asset level owner. So, and here are just some boundaries for new construction. So carbon neutral construction scope 1 and 2, right? And the audit boundaries, acceptable plans address the entire carbon footprint of and environmental impacts of that construction site, right? So, and we can dig a little deeper into this. So it's the architectural design and the owner's decisions. It starts there. So if you've got an all glass building, you're going to have to consider bird strikes and things of that nature, because those have environmental impacts that are actually pre-measured, and you can actually include them. And you're going to want to include all the material EPDs, right, through final commissioning, and hand over the building to the management corporation or the building management or the owner. So it starts with the EPDs, and then you're collecting all the job site fuel, water, waste. All of that is getting collected, and there's a way to calculate all of that and determine that carbon footprint for that building for construction, right? And if you want to call it carbon neutral, then you offset that entire carbon bill with carbon offsets, and then you're allowed to claim carbon neutrality, right? So that's where that comes into play. And
for Sorry, I was about to interject another question, if I may. For real estate construction, what's the difference, as you've just been, between carbon neutral construction plans and net zero construction plans? And is one preferred over the other, and how are they both audited?
They're audited exactly the same,
Okay.
right? Just as a heads up. And you set the audit boundaries, and then it depends on what you're including in that audit boundary. So net zero emissions sets the audit boundaries at scopes 1, 2, and 3, as opposed to scope 1 and 2, right? And that means that you have an acceptable plan that includes everything in carbon neutrality of that construction audit boundary that we just talked about in the earlier slide, and that all the businesses that are doing business with you on that site are carbon neutral. Back to my example with Dell and me claiming net zero emissions, right? Very simple. So that's all the construction companies, all the material companies, everybody in that chain has to be carbon neutral for you to be able to claim it. So when people say, hey, I've got a net zero emissions building, I start wondering what they're talking about. And it's usually one of the green building rating system make-believe claims, which the SEC is definitely going to be fining for. So let's talk about, how do you model this?
Good. And we had a question about that with regard to carbon neutral construction and the carbon footprint modeling and environmental impacts from architectural design and owner decisions, environmental impacts of the construction, and all site energy, water use, construction materials, and waste generated.
Right. And there you go. That's carbon neutral if you collect all of it. And remember, you're going to have to collect the refrigerants in the building, how much was installed. Those have to be accounted for, which is going to be probably some of your larger carbon footprints right up there with your steel and or concrete construction. So if you're looking at the three largest footprints on most job sites, it's concrete, steel, and refrigerants. So that's where they come out to play. And then it sort of falls down after that, unless you, of course, you're importing stone from India or other things. But those are probably going to be your largest users. So 14,001, right? That's our audit that we're going to be performing here, 64 and 65, right? And it requires an updated annually model. So we updated it to COP25, right? And that's where our model is. And the major updates for COP25 was that they all agreed on, if the country reports by individual grid, you're to use those grid numbers. If it reports an average for the country, you can use the country average number. Or if it's reporting by province average, you can use the province average number. Or if it's reporting by an overall country average with subgrid reporting, you have the choice, right? So here in the US, we report by eGrid. So that's the way we report that, right? And that's the way the model is set up. For example, I'll cite Chile. They have 2 grids and they just interconnected them. Japan also has 2 grids and they just interconnected both of those. So I can average those 2 grids and determine what the country average is. But if I wanted to get a tighter audit boundary, I would then select the grid that particular project was in. So that's why I said the flexibility on audit boundaries makes it very important, but you have to be blunt and you have to be transparent on what you're selecting. So, and the only model to use is one that is actually updated to the annual comps, right? And if they're not updated to all of those requirements, then the model is outdated already. And the comps occur every year. Obviously, we had to skip for COVID.
George, with the carbon neutral construction boundary, why is it and the modeling, why is it including all these different factors?
Why is it including all the different factors?
Like land use changes, site preparation, building occupant, commuting, all that other stuff.
It's because that's actually falls over into how your employees are getting to and from that job site.
Okay.
Right, and where they're parking from. So if I'm claiming a carbon neutral construction site, I would be looking at that being part of my scope 3, or I could include it as part of my scope 2. So that's a flexibility on ISO boundary. But I need to also tell everybody that I included it or excluded it. Right? So those would be perfect audit boundary decisions. So underneath the GHG protocol, you can take employee commuting from scope 2 and put it into scope 3. Right? But you still have to account for it. You just need to be able to clearly define it in your audit boundaries. That's why these are comparable across all sectors. So carbon footprint models. So this is it's a unique case, but models are all customized. We customize our data maps to our clients on what they're filling out, how they're filling it in. So I just cited a customization that a client might want. We're taking employees and putting them in scope 3 versus having them in scope 2. So we've seen people do this with business travel also. And business travel, I would tell you, is direct, and I would make the argument that you should include it in your scope 2. But it's as long as you're clean and clear about it. That's how the data maps are developed for doing a carbon footprint model that's repeated year over year over year, right? And then our models actually come on with a BI display. We'll take a look at an example of one, and then I've got some videos that you guys can take a look at the end off of this presentation on some of the stuff that we do look at. So, and then once you model an asset or a facility, that rolls up to the regional, and then that rolls up to corporate. And so you have a corporate carbon footprint model. That's why ISO is talking about an asset level audit first. There is no cash models out there that are ISO. And so that's very important to understand.
So you have defined net zero construction, scope 1, 2, and 3 is everything from carbon neutral construction, audit boundaries, plus value chain carbon footprint, scope 3. Help us understand the parameters, which you've talked about now a bit. And I guess you'll show us a little bit of this in your modeling here.
Right. So scope 3 is your entire value chain. The way a lot of companies handle it, right, is if they are looking at starting to go carbon neutral on a job site or a construction project, usually the developer will analyze their carbon footprint, right? Or the company, the REIT that's actually doing the construction or commissioning the construction. Then they will actually send out to everybody else within that supply chain a requirement that they have an ISO 14001 audit done. And they're going to report back. And if you don't do it, you're probably not going to be on the bid list. So real straightforward, because that gives them a view of what your carbon footprint looks like if you're in that supply chain, right? So depending on how that supply chain reacts when that audit goes out, there's a lot that's out there. We've got many clients that have reached out and have dropped people out of their supply chain because they did not want to do ISO. They were claiming LEED or IFLI or some other CASB or one of these other green globes, and it's not UN. They can't report that to the UN. Very simple, right? They're not recognized by the UN. They're not reportable to the UN. They make no difference. So if you want to claim that, it's maybe nice to have, but you're not within SEC boundaries or Treasury boundaries at that point. So monthly, we actually do our carbon footprint totals. If you're doing an IoT system with us, which we'll look at later, we can do it every 5 minutes. But this gives you the monthly presentation of everything that you're seeing for your scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions and how those are breaking out, right? And then you get monthly tracking, and you can select any one of the sources. All of these would be, if the model was up and running live, we'd be able to click on one of the sources, and then you'd actually get a chance to see what that source was, why it was peaking, how come, when, where, and why. So it gives you a really good fine detail down to the facility level, if it's a corporate roll-up, right? And we also track all your SDGs, and we can actually give you your scope 3 impacts, and we can also give you your scope 3 emissions if you're a supplier allows an IoT application going in. So we're seeing a lot of that in supply chains, trying to get a handle on those scopes. And that's why I said a lot of people are pushing the ISO audits out and requiring their supply chains to report to the UN at this point, and they're still not getting valid data. So we developed an IoT system that actually does that, calculates it on site, and you can actually see that reporting real time. So let's continue a little bit. So we actually have done this for a number of clients, and these are the 2 training videos that we have actually developed, which we won't get into here, but they will be in the presentation, and that's on our YouTube channel. So we use actual data and average data, right? The average data model is used when you're looking at remote employees, right? Or remote offices. If you're working in a co-working space, or if you're working in someplace other to where you're not getting a real utility bill, then it's average data. If you want to model hotel room nights, that's average data. And it's done by zip code, just as a heads up globally. So we can actually pull all that up. That's why the 2 separate models. And our integrated model, it just automatically rolls both of these together to give you that nice BI. So let's talk carbon offsets and carbon offset markets. This is
and good. And we had a question about evaluating the carbon offsets and carbon offset market opportunities. How do we determine what's real, and what is greenwashing?
We're going to give a couple good cases of that. So just as a heads up.
Thank you.
So, and they were all in the news. So I'm not letting any cats out of the bag. So major corporate greenwashing, right? Let's talk about it. So purchasing carbon offsets from a non-approved United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change registry. If you don't know what you're buying, you shouldn't be buying it. And if you don't know where it came from, you should be asking. So the UN actually has 3 registries that they have, 4 total, but 3 registries that they recognize. And we'll talk about those. The Nature Conservancy faked millions on millions of dollars of forest offsets because they used a non-UNFCCC registry, and they used a Kyoto protocol for trees that was long since retired, and the projects were actually newly filed, and they sold it to JetBlue, they sold it to BlackRock, they sold it to Disney. So rather nice, and these guys were claiming carbon offsetting. And somebody stepped in and said where, what, when, why, tracked it back and found out it was all fake. So just as a heads up. So you have to buyer beware, right? So, and insetting is the other big one that the fashion industry and the cosmetics industry and the food industry does a lot of. So they invest in their supply chain on generating a quote unquote carbon offset project. And then they claim the offsets there is no transparency. They don't file it with a carbon offset registry, right, to make it public or anything else. So that comes into greenwashing once again. Lack of transparency, lack of UN reporting. The UN would not allow either one of these claims through. Right? And here, no UNFCCC CDM. 90% of the time, that's what the insetting is following. It's some made-up protocol by somebody. Right? No UN-approved carbon offset registry. We already mentioned that. And no third-party review. And if there is a third-party review, it's the no CDM, and it's not publicly reported. So that sort of, covers the three major points of greenwashing right there. And that's why I said no public reporting or transparency on the claim. So that would draw a lot of SEC review, Treasury review, right? Public review. So, and let's take a little closer dive at what is happening within supply chains. Claiming net zero emissions, right? Excluding employee travel and work travel related to work. I took a look at several reports that came out last year for a lot of major consulting firms, and they excluded employee travel, right? And they're using green building rating systems. So they claimed all their offices were LEED and therefore carbon neutral to the LEED zero. No, those are not UN applicable reporting standards, right? They don't meet the UNCC carbon neutral now program. And there's also violating a whole bunch of EPA claims when they're using RECs, calling them carbon neutral RECs, and then applying them to your energy and trash use and all the rest of this stuff. EPA already has a ruling on that. You just violated it. So I wouldn't doubt that the SEC would actually do this.
George, another question has come up. What do we need to take into consideration in our net zero construction project plans? And can you offer an example from the real estate industry? And just so you know, we're about at 9:54 right now. So
that is actually a project. To answer that question, that would actually be a probably 3-hour discussion. So, and we could definitely do a deep dive on that at some further point in time. But those are questions that we would have to lay out the entire audit boundaries for a particular project and then walk you through all of that development. So let's review this very quickly, right? Properly performed corporate ISO 14001 audits are going to discover potential carbon offset projects. And we use the United Nations Framework Convention Clean Development Mechanisms, which is where all of the carbon offset projects are listed. And they will tell you if they're valid or retired or invalid at this point, right? And on top of the additional CDMs, we have to be totally walked through and approved on a carbon offset registry. So the UN has a registry, Vera is the other registry, and Gold Standard is the third registry. So if we're not going to the UN, we're going to Vera or we're going to Gold Standard. So, and sometimes it depends on pricing. So just on size of project, things of that nature. So let's take a look and let's go a little deeper dive, right? So if a project has been approved, it's got to be additional, right? It's got to be outside the norm, in other words, right? And it's got to be a permanent reduction, not a transient reduction. And you have to have clear project boundaries and have measurable environmental impacts. And you also have to have measurable social and governance impacts in the project. So this brings into 3 prongs that you have to have in a carbon offset project. And a lot of companies are looking at it and now starting to align to those 3 prongs. So the United Nations Framework, CDM. So we did a methane capture and destruction project, right? They were generating renewable energy, and this was a composting site. This is one of the ones that was taking food and running it as composting and selling the renewable energy. That's a very nice carbon offset project for that food processor. The other one that we actually did was 100% renewable energy for a REIT, and they were using 150,000 megawatt hours a year. And that was a gorgeous carbon offset project because we set it as a state boundary for our audit to include all of their facilities, which really made it work well. And then electric material handling, or EV charging stations, right? Done. For your trucks, electric trucks, for electric cars, and your electric forklifts. These are standard. And we're seeing more and more cold storage buildings installing automated ones. That's a great low carbon fuel standard project. So carbon offset registries, once again, if we jump back to the registry level, we can take a look at the UNFCCC carbon offset registry. You'll find it on the UN website. Vera, we already discussed, and gold standard. What's the big difference between the three of these? Is that Vera and gold standard actually do additional CDM development. So if you think something could be a carbon offset project, they actually have a protocol, and it's going to cost you a little bit of money to be able to run it. That's where you're seeing some of the soil sequestration for agriculture come into play, things of that nature. So those are where the Vera is, where those are coming out of right now. Gold standard pioneered the, we'll call it the cook stove offsets, and they've really refined that down in various versions, so it makes it worthwhile, right? So here's our three items that we want to talk about when we're talking about a carbon offset project. It's 1 metric ton of CO2e not released to the atmosphere, or 1 metric ton of CO2e captured from the atmosphere. And the UN is moving all the CDMs to CO2e removal versus release as we slowly clean up the planet, because we've got to make up for what we've already dumped. So this gives you a little bit better view on offset projects. And the US SEC has defined carbon offsets as a security. So if you're buying offsets and you're not buying them through a regulated broker dealer, you're going to have an issue, right? And if the person you're buying them from, it doesn't have a regulated broker dealer, and you're not filing the proper paperwork with the SEC, those offsets are once again going to be invalid. So here's the three prongs. Environment, right, is a big one. 1 metric ton of CO2e not released or sequestered, right? Social impacts. So this is local, state, province, national economy impacts that, or environmental health that this project would generate. Renewable energy is a big one for that. So you're not polluting the air with coal or diesel, right? And then governance, right? What are you doing with the money? Where is it being respent? How is it being redispersed? You know, how are you mitigating additional risks? So what's the stakeholder involvement? So those are the three things that a lot of companies are looking at when they're looking at offsetting.
George, being respectful of your time and the audience's
I see we're out of
time, do you have an extra 5 minutes?
I do if they do, because we're almost done.
Yeah, good. Okay, so I'm going to please ask you to please continue. Our next question was about the life cycle of carbon offsets. So please continue.
Okay, so here's the carbon offset life cycle. I won't get into it. It's a little lengthy, but you guys can take a look at it. So, and this was representing renewable all the way to retirement on the registry. So this is what it takes to generate an offset that you buy and retire in your name or the project's name, right? Regulated carbon offset markets. So once again, they're securities. So the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission regulates the markets, right? And regulated broker dealer, as we discussed earlier, ETSs are emission trading schemes, right, for carbon offsets. That's the EU version. And then EU ETSs are exchanged underneath the SEC version of the EU. And then the Western Climate Initiative. So we have, that's a big one. And then the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative here in North America are the Western and Eastern current carbon markets. So, and NTREX plays into this because it's a multinational market and it's regulated by the SEC. As a matter of fact, we're talking with the Japanese about opening an NTREX market pit for the Japanese offsets to be traded. So, and this is where corporate buyers buy, sell, and trade, and the market's running right now about 45 billion in volume. So we need to talk about that. When corporates are considering offsetting, these are already approved, they're already checked, chain of custody, all the rest of that. It's under a broker dealer. Everything is done appropriately to meet those requirements for the SEC. And you can learn more about NTREX there.
And our final question had to do with you've taken so much of your goodwill and time to help us understand and unpack this highly confusing technology and reporting requirements. What you've given advice during this the webinar, cautionary ideas. What additional recommendations might you have from your work in the field that will help our participants and other peoples who will be listening in afterwards to this recording?
Not a problem. So these are questions we've gotten from companies. Is your company reporting carbon neutrality, right? Climate neutrality or environmental claims? Are they correct? Right? To the UN. If you are purchasing carbon offsets, are they being reported to the US SEC? Right? No. Oh, I didn't know I had to do that. Okay. So therefore, they're probably invalid. Is the company missing out on a carbon offset project income stream? We've seen corporate carbon offset projects starting at about $1 million of additional revenue, upwards of $15 to $25 million of additional revenue, just in material handling, right? Electrification of material handling. So that gives you scope and size of those projects. And, here, my last big question, are you under any market pressure? Is your supply chain pushing you to report? As I talked about, have you received an ISO requirement, or are they telling you to report to CDP or other? Now it's you're having to report to the UN. So, questions?
George, my final question for you, and I'm looking to see if there's questions from the audience right now that we haven't covered, but unless they appear, what is your bird watching agenda this coming month?
Actually, there's not much going on because we're starting to get into breeding season. So everything's starting to quiet down. Migration's still going on a little bit, but otherwise, it's going to be more just time outside if the weather holds up. Right now, I'm in Chicago. It's a little wet here.
I want to thank you so much for generously sharing your time and expertise to address these critical ESG reporting changes and best practices for companies grappling with how best to report and manage their ESG mandates. George's slides with a summary and a recording link to this webinar will be posted on the LINKCO website. The recording will be posted on LINKCO's YouTube channel. Stay tuned for additional webinars on this and other topics via the LINKCO website and via our LinkedIn postings. At the end of the webinar, please take a minute to fill out the survey. It will help us evaluate and improve our series going forward. Your feedback is much appreciated. LINKCO Executive Search provides elite companies with top CXOs and upper management nationwide using a proprietary step-by-step process for both clients and candidates. We are on 24/7, 365. And when you need help, please call upon us. Thanks for
Thanks.
joining us, and stay safe. Thank you so much, George.
Thanks, guys.